Julian Thorne stood on his meticulously maintained patio, a tumbler of iced tea sweating in his hand, watching the ripples dance across his private pool. It was a perfect square of sapphire in the emerald expanse of his backyard, a testament to years of hard work and the one true luxury he'd allowed himself. The faint scent of chlorine mingled with blooming jasmine, a scent that usually brought him profound peace. Today, however, it only served to highlight the gnawing anxiety in his gut. Across the pristine lawn, beyond the perfectly trimmed hedges, the silhouette of Agnes Periwinkle, the self-appointed, iron-fisted president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA, was a dark stain on his tranquil afternoon. She stood with her arms crossed, a posture that perfectly conveyed her perpetual state of disapproval, her eyes like twin lasers fixed on his property. Specifically, on his pool. Their war had been simmering for months, a slow-burn conflict born from Agnes's insatiable need for control and Julian's stubborn refusal to yield an inch of his personal space. It started subtly, notices about lawn height, paint color, the precise angle of his mailbox. Then came the accusations, veiled at first, escalating to outright declarations. His pool, she insisted, was a community amenity. An absurdity, Julian knew, written nowhere in the HOA bylaws he'd meticulously reviewed before purchasing the house 5 years ago. He remembered the first direct confrontation. It had been during the annual HOA meeting, a thinly veiled dictatorship disguised as a democratic process. Agnes, perched imperiously at the head of a long table, had cleared her throat, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on him. "Mr. Thorne," she'd begun, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that curdled the air, "we've had a few concerns regarding your backyard activities." Julian, leaning back in his chair, had simply raised an eyebrow. "Concerns, Mrs. Periwinkle? About what, precisely?" "Your pool," she'd stated, drawing out the word as if it were some illicit substance. "It's come to my attention that it is quite large. And, being a central feature of your property, visible from several common areas, it has been assumed by some residents to be a shared recreational facility." A low murmur had rippled through the small assembly. Julian had scoffed, a genuine, mirthless sound. "Assumed? My deed, Mrs. Periwinkle, clearly states this is private property. The pool was installed by the previous owner, well before this HOA even existed in its current form. It's listed on my property survey. It's mine." Agnes's smile had tightened, her eyes narrowing. "Well, that's where the discrepancy lies, isn't it? The original plat maps for Maple Creek Estates show a designated recreational zone precisely where your pool now stands. A curious oversight, perhaps." The accusation had been delivered with such conviction, Julian had almost doubted himself. But he knew. He'd done his homework. He'd hired a lawyer to review everything when her first passive-aggressive notes began appearing. There was no recreational zone. It was a fabrication, pure and simple, designed to justify her latest power grab. "There is no discrepancy," Julian had replied, his voice calm but laced with steel. "And there is certainly no recreational zone on my property. This is a private pool. It remains private." The meeting had devolved into a heated argument, with Agnes attempting to rally support for a motion to reclassify his pool. She'd failed, narrowly, but the seed of resentment had been sown deep. Julian had won the battle, but the war, he realized, was just beginning. Since then, the incursions had escalated. First, children from the neighborhood, emboldened by their parents' whispers or perhaps Agnes's direct encouragement, had started peering over his fence. Then, small objects, a deflated beach ball, a child's sandal would accidentally land in his pool, requiring a polite but firm request for their retrieval. Julian had installed taller privacy screens, then security cameras, but the constant vigilance was draining. The worst incident had been last week. He'd found a crude, hand-painted sign duct-taped to his back gate, facing inwards, "Community Pool Hours, 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Below it, in smaller, neater letters, was Agnes Periwinkle's signature. That had been the turning point. That had pushed him from weary annoyance to a simmering, dangerous rage. He remembered holding that sign, the cheap plywood rough in his hands, staring at the sloppy red paint. His breath had hitched, a primal sense of violation washing over him. This wasn't just about property anymore, it was about outright disrespect, a deliberate affront to his peace and privacy. He'd torn the sign down, ripped it into splinters, and thrown it into his trash can with a force that rattled the bin. Now, as Agnes continued her silent, menacing vigil across the hedge, Julian felt a cold resolve har. The air crackled with a different kind of anticipation as Leo's beat-up utility van rumbled down Julian's driveway a few hours later. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns of Maple Creek Estates. Julian met him at the back gate, a subtle tension thrumming beneath his composed exterior. Leo, a man whose enthusiasm for the exotic often outstripped his common sense, grinned, revealing a gap between his front teeth. "Julian, my man. Ready for the main event." He gestured to the back of the van, where several large, opaque plastic containers were secured. A faint, earthy scent, unmistakably fishy, drifted from them. "As I'll ever be," Julian replied, his voice low. He glanced around, making sure the coast was clear. Agnes Periwinkle had long since retreated indoors, presumably to plot her next HOA-sanctioned maneuver. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a paranoia that had become a constant companion since this whole ordeal began. "All right, let's get these beauties in their new home," Leo said, already unlatching the van's back doors. "Remember what I told you. They're not going to be thrilled about the chlorine, but a few days of aeration and a steady diet, and they'll adapt. Just make sure you know, don't swim for a while." He chuckled, but Julian didn't join him. This was no laughing matter. Carefully, they began to unload the containers. Each one was heavy, sloshing with water, and Julian could feel the subtle movements within, the frantic darting of something alive and predatory. He opened the first lid just a crack, peering inside. Dark, iridescent scales shimmered in the fading light, and a single, unblinking eye stared back, radiating an ancient, primal hunger. A shiver ran down his spine. These weren't goldfish. They worked quickly and efficiently. Leo had brought a long, flexible PVC pipe, which he extended from the containers to the edge of the pool. "Acclimation tube," he explained, whispering as if the fish might hear him. "Gradually introduce them to the new water. Don't want to shock them too much." Julian watched, a strange mix of exhilaration and unease swirling within him. He was actually doing this. He was stocking his private pool with piranhas. The sheer audacity of it was almost intoxicating. He imagined Agnes's face, her horrified gasp, when she inevitably discovered his drastic solution. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. As the last of the fish were slowly siphoned into the pool, Julian knelt by the edge, watching them disappear into the depths. The water, so recently a pristine expanse, now held a hidden, dangerous secret. He could almost feel their presence, a collective, silent threat lurking beneath the surface. It was done. "All right, my work here is done," Leo announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'll be honest, Julian, this is a bold move. Even for you." Julian finally looked at his friend, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "She asked for a community pool, Leo. I'm giving her a community pool unlike anything she could have imagined." Leo shook his head, a mixture of admiration and apprehension on his face. "Just be careful. These aren't pets, Julian. They're wild animals, and they follow instinct." After Leo left, the quiet of the night descended, heavier and more profound than usual. Julian stood by the pool for a long time, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his arms. He listened to the cicadas, the distant rumble of traffic, and the almost imperceptible whisper of the water. He half expected to hear a splash, a ripple, a sign of the new inhabitants. But there was nothing. Only the silence, pregnant with anticipation. He went inside, his house feeling suddenly too large, too empty. He tried to read, to watch TV, but his mind kept drifting back to the dark water outside. He imagined the piranhas, circling, exploring their new territory, their razor teeth eager for a meal. He had been so consumed by his anger, by his desire for retribution, that he hadn't fully considered the implications, the sheer weight of what he had unleashed. The next morning, Julian woke with a start, the first rays of dawn painting the bedroom walls in soft hues. He rushed to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered into the backyard. The pool shimmered, innocent and blue under the morning light. Too innocent. He went out, a slight tremor in his hands, and walked to the edge. The water was still. Not a single ripple. Had they survived the night? Had he done something foolish? He felt a prickle of doubt, a momentary flash of regret. But then a faint, almost imperceptible shadow darted beneath the surface, then another and another. They were there. They were alive. Just as he was about to turn away, a small, brightly colored object drifted into view, carried by the gentle current towards the filter. It was a child's plastic toy boat, bright red, with a tiny, smiling sailor. July. The disappearance of the toy boat sent a jolt through Julian, a potent cocktail of triumph and chilling realization. He had crossed a line, one from which there was no easy return. The pool was no longer merely a defiant statement. It was now a live, unpredictable entity. He felt a morbid fascination, a perverse pride in the terror he was about to unleash upon Agnes Periwinkle's meticulously ordered world. His phone buzzed. It was Leo. "Julian, you there?" "I heard a thing." "What thing?" Julian asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, though a tremor of excitement ran through him. "A rumor," Leo said, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "About a missing toy boat. And a very agitated parent. Apparently, little Timmy's pride and joy vanished from the pool after being accidentally blown over the fence. And some rather unpleasant noises were heard." Julian allowed himself a small, satisfied smirk. "Oh? Unpleasant noises, you say?" "Yeah, like a flock of angry seagulls fighting over a discarded fish," Leo elaborated. "Look, Julian, I know you wanted to send a message, but you need to be careful. People are going to start asking questions. And if word gets out about what's in there, you'll have more than just the HOA on your back." "Let them ask," Julian retorted, his resolve hardening. "Let them wonder. This is my property, Leo. And if something falls into my private pool, it's no one's business but mine what happens to it." He could almost hear Leo shaking his head on the other end. "All right, just don't call me when the Fish and Wildlife Department comes knocking. Or PETA." The phone call ended, leaving Julian alone with the hum of the pool filter and the silent, hungry presence beneath the water. He spent the rest of the day in a heightened state of alert, half expecting a knock on the door, a frantic phone call, or even Agnes herself, marching across his lawn with a posse of concerned neighbors. Nothing happened. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, a quiet before the storm. The next morning, however, the storm began to gather. Julian was sipping his coffee, watching the morning news, when a sharp, insistent rapping echoed through his house. He strode to the front door, his heart hammering. Standing on his porch, radiating barely contained fury, was a woman he vaguely recognized as Timmy's mother, Mrs. Henderson. Beside her, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, holding a clipboard, introduced himself as Mr. Davies, an enforcement officer from the HOA. And of course, Agnes Periwinkle stood slightly behind them, her face a mask of prim concern that Julian knew was pure performance. "Mr. Thorne," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice tight with suppressed anger, "my son's toy boat went missing from your pool yesterday. We saw it go in. I demand to know what happened to it." Julian crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, projecting an air of casual indifference he didn't quite feel. "Mrs. Henderson, I apologize, but I'm not responsible for toys that enter my private property. Perhaps your son should be taught to keep his belongings in his own yard. Agnes stepped forward, her voice saccharine. Julian, dear, perhaps there's a misunderstanding. Mrs. Henderson is quite distressed. And frankly, we've had reports of unusual activity in your pool area. Mr. Davies adjusted his glasses, his gaze sweeping over Julian's property. Mr. Thorne, the HOA has received several complaints regarding the condition and activities within your pool. We have grounds to request an inspection. Julian's blood ran cold. An inspection. That was Agnes's endgame. Get into his backyard, find the piranhas, and then what? Eviction? A forced removal of his pool? He felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal need to protect his home, his sanctuary, his dangerous secret. An inspection? Julian scoffed, straightening up. On what grounds, precisely? I pay my dues, my property is meticulously maintained, and my pool is spotless. Furthermore, it is private. You have no legal right to inspect my private property without a court order or a clear violation of a bylaw, which I assure you, does not exist. Agnes's face flushed, her composure momentarily cracking. The bylaws state that all residential properties must maintain a safe and non-hazardous environment for the community. And if there are unusual creatures in your pool, that absolutely constitutes a hazard. Unusual creatures. Julian raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Are we talking about the occasional wasp, Agnes? Or perhaps a particularly daring squirrel? My pool is perfectly safe, for those who are invited. He emphasized the last word, his gaze piercing Mrs. Henderson, however, was not to be deterred by legalistic sparring. Her maternal instinct was in overdrive. There were sounds, Mr. Thorne. My neighbor heard them. Thrashing. Like something tearing. And then the boat was gone. What kind of animals do you have in there? Julian paused, letting the... Agnes Periwinkle was a woman who believed in the power of procedure, especially when it could be weaponized. Julian knew this. He spent the next few days in a state of hyper-awareness, watching for certified letters, legal notices, anything that signaled her next move. It came not as a document, but as an invasion. He was in his home office, absorbed in a complex spreadsheet, when the rhythmic thudding started. A dull, insistent sound, growing louder. It wasn't a knock. It was something far more deliberate, more architectural. Julian dropped his pen, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He strode to the back window, pulling back the curtain. His jaw tightened, a cold dread seeping into his bones. There, on the other side of his property line, precisely where his cherished privacy hedge met Agnes's pristine, but utterly bland, flower bed, stood a small army of contractors. 2 men were operating a mini-excavator, its hydraulic arm already tearing at the earth. Another was meticulously measuring with a laser level, while a fourth, clipboard in hand, directed the operation with the efficiency of a general. And, of course, Agnes Periwinkle herself stood slightly apart, a triumphant, almost giddy smirk on her face, like a cat who just swallowed a canary. They were building a fence. Not just any fence, but a towering, chain-link monstrosity, topped with barbed wire, cutting off the view of his pool entirely. It was a prison wall, erected on her property, but designed solely to spite him. The very visible signs that marked it as HOA property, authorized construction, were like daggers to his sense of peace. Julian burst out of his back door, crossing his lawn in long, angry strides. "What the hell is going on here, Agnes?" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. Agnes turned, her smile widening into something truly venomous. "Why, Mr. Thorne, good afternoon. As you can see, the HOA is merely exercising its right to improve community property. As per Section 4.7b of the Maple Creek Estates bylaws, the HOA reserves the right to erect fencing or other architectural barriers on common property or property adjacent to common property to enhance aesthetic appeal, ensure resident safety, or delineate property lines." She paused, savoring his incandescent rage. We believe this new barrier will serve all three purposes admirably. Especially the resident safety clause, given the uncertainties emanating from your backyard. Julian stared at the encroaching steel, the heavy machinery already digging deep foundations. This is harassment. You're deliberately trying to antagonize me. This isn't for aesthetic appeal. It's an eyesore. And it's aimed directly at my pool. Your pool, Mr. Thorne, Agnes said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, is a source of considerable concern. After all, a missing child's toy, strange noises, one can't be too careful. This fence, you see, is for the protection of the children in our community. From what might be lurking. She glanced pointedly at his pool, a knowing glint in her eyes that he saw red. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about her flexing her power, crushing his spirit, and destroying the sanctuary he'd worked so hard for. The sheer audacity, the thinly veiled malice, was breathtaking. You can't do this! Julian shouted, gesturing wildly at the construction crew. This is an abuse of power. I'll sue the HOA for harassment, for property devaluation, for emotional distress. Agnes merely chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You're welcome to try, Mr. Thorne. But I assure you, our legal team has reviewed every clause, every bylaw. We are perfectly within our rights, and by the time you manage to get a court date, this fence will be fully erected, a permanent testament to the HOA's commitment to safety. The contractors, oblivious to the verbal sparring, continued their work, the clang of metal on metal a jarring counterpoint to Julian's rage. He watched in impotent fury as the first heavy chain-link panels were hoisted into place, slowly, irrevocably blocking his view, segmenting his world. It was like watching a wall being built around his very soul. He retreated, defeated for the moment, but his mind raced. This was a tactical retreat, not a surrender. Agnes had used the bylaws against him, twisted them into a weapon. He needed to find his own weapon. Something unexpected. Something that would bypass her bureaucratic fortress. He spent the rest of the day in a dark, brooding silence, the incessant noise of the construction a constant torment. He tried to ignore it, to focus on other things, but every clank, every thud, was a reminder of Agnes's relentless assault. He couldn't even see his pool anymore from his back patio, only the grim, gray mesh of the fence. Late that night, long after the contractors had packed up and the neighborhood had fallen silent, Julian crept outside. The fence stood like a jagged scar against the installation of the cameras became Julian's new obsession. He and Leo worked under the cover of darkness 2 nights later, the silence of Maple Creek Estates broken only by the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves. Leo, despite his reservations, was meticulous. They mounted 3 high-definition, motion-activated cameras, complete with night vision and sensitive directional microphones, to robust poles securely cemented into Julian's side of the property line. Each camera was strategically angled to capture not just the new chain-link fence, but also a significant portion of Agnes Periwinkle's adjacent yard, particularly the path leading from her back door to the newly erected barrier. "Remember, Julian," Leo whispered as he tightened the final bracket, "these are purely for security. If anyone asks, you're just protecting your property from further incursions." He gave Julian a knowing look, implying the double meaning. "And the microphones? They're for environmental sound monitoring, obviously." Julian nodded, a tight, grim line to his mouth. "Understood. I'm just documenting ongoing harassment." He felt a surge of cold satisfaction. Agnes had built her wall, now he was putting up his eyes and ears. He had studied the bylaws again, found the loopholes. While recording inside someone else's private residence without consent was illegal, recording activities visible from his property line, especially in a dispute involving property lines and alleged harassment, was a much grayer area. He planned to stay firmly in the gray. Over the next few days, Julian meticulously reviewed the footage. It was tedious work, hours of uneventful recordings of squirrels chasing each other, birds landing on the fence, and the occasional dog walker. But he was patient. He knew Agnes couldn't resist. She had to react. Her reaction came on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered with a theatrical flair only Agnes could muster. Julian was watching a live feed from one of the cameras on his laptop, a bag of microwave popcorn balanced on his knee, when he saw her. She emerged from her back door, a determined set to her jaw, clad in a floral gardening smock and oversized sunglasses that did little to hide her narrowed gaze. In her hands, she clutched a large, brightly colored beach umbrella, one of those garish, striped monstrosities Julian had always detested. She marched directly to the chain-link fence, her eyes scanning Julian's side with an almost frantic intensity. Julian saw the moment she spotted the cameras, small, dark lenses strategically tucked just above the hedge line. Her body stiffened. He could almost feel her outrage radiating through the screen. Then, slowly, deliberately, she began to unfurl the umbrella. Julian leaned forward, a slow smile spreading across his face. He knew what she was doing. She was attempting to block the cameras, to create her own personal privacy screen against his surveillance. It was petty, childish, and utterly predictable. It was also, he realized, exactly what he needed. Agnes struggled with the umbrella, its bright fabric flapping in a gentle breeze. She tried to wedge it between the fence posts, then to secure it with twist ties she pulled from her smock pocket. The entire time, she muttered under her breath, a low, guttural grumbling that the directional microphones, even from a slight distance, picked up with surprising clarity. Audacity, invasion of privacy. This man is a menace, absolute disregard. I'll show him, these cameras will not stand. Her voice was a venomous whisper, punctuated by frustrated grunts as the umbrella refused to cooperate. Julian, popcorn forgotten, started recording the feed directly. This was gold. She wasn't just blocking the view, she was verbally confessing her intent to obstruct. Finally, with a triumphant huff, Agnes managed to secure the umbrella, its loud, striped pattern now completely obscuring the view of a significant portion of her yard, and crucially, one of the cameras. She stood back, admiring her handiwork, a smug satisfaction replacing her earlier frustration. But then, she made her biggest mistake. She turned to face Julian's yard, knowing he was likely watching. Her sunglasses slipped slightly, revealing a flash of triumphant, malicious eyes. And then she spoke, her voice rising, no longer a whisper, but a clear, loud declaration. "You think you're so clever, Julian Thorne?" she practically shrieked, gesturing wildly at the umbrella. "You think you can spy on me? Well, two can play at that game. This is just the beginning. You and your piranhas. This entire neighborhood knows what you've done. And we will not stand for it." The word piranhas hung in the air, crisp and clear, captured perfectly by the microphone. Julian froze, his breath catching. She didn't just suspect, she knew. Or at least, she was operating under the firm conviction that his pool harbored dangerous fish. And she had just broadcast